Well, good morning, everyone. We had a nice time in Kansas City last week. We missed you all, the meal, and more than the meal, but we did miss you. But we had a good time at the Michael Bublé concert. Just a neat show, wonderful songs, very wholesome and uplifting, I think, for the verses, a lot of the songs that you hear today. We also have another birthday coming up this week. We'll have 2 teenagers in our household come next Wednesday. Jack will be 13 years old. I can't hardly believe it. Brethren, I'd like you to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32 with me this morning. I want to bring you a message that will be relating to the Feast of Trumpets here, thinking about what that day pictures, as it's coming up very shortly here, a little over a week away. Deuteronomy chapter 32, as we lead into this message, I want to read just this section here where it says, "He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of a wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he guarded him as the apple of his eye." So these are the words of Moses the prophet about how God found Israel in a barren wasteland, in a desert. And it's part of a much bigger picture in the Bible. You see, the Bible begins with a picture of watery chaos that churned over the earth. You remember that in the book of Genesis. But it was Jeremiah who connects the chaos of water with the desert. It's kind of a weird thought that you have water and desert that are connecting each other. So the desert then becomes a metaphor for chaos, for suffering, for pain. But it's also a metaphor for a place of personal growth that we've heard about before, a place of preparation, of reliance, of provision, rather on God, on God rather than on yourselves. It's an interesting metaphor because on one hand, the desert is a dangerous place that's filled with peril. It has poisonous snakes, it has scorpions, there's lions, there's bears, and there's demons that live out in the desert. And there is little to no water and little to no shade with blazing sun. The desert's a dangerous place, and yet sometimes it's also a place of refuge. We know, for instance, that David took refuge from Saul in the desert. We know that Moses took refuge from Pharaoh, the Israelites from Egypt, and Elijah from Jezebel. See, brethren, there are many lessons that we can learn in the desert, and I want to show you one of them today. We often think of deserts as flat and sandy, where you can see for miles and miles. You may have a picture of like the Sahara Desert in your mind when you think of a desert. But in the Sinai Desert, they're mountainous and they're rocky, and there's a lot of, rocks that create sort of these pathways that sort of wind around in the desert in Sinai, where you often can't see for more than maybe a couple hundred feet in front of you and more than a couple hundred feet behind you. So you think about, for instance, the children of Israel as they were moving through there. It's not like you could see the whole company. You only could see parts. You often didn't know what was coming around the next corner, what was around the next bend, what were you going to find. It was a little bit scary maybe at times. Certain parts of Egypt you could see, for maybe miles in the flat terrain, but not here. So whether you're in the desert of Sinai or Negev, relying on God for your survival was essential. God knew where he was leading his people, and he knew where he was leading the patriarchs even earlier as well. In fact, the Israelites are mentioned as wandering in the wilderness. I think that's only mentioned 3 times maybe. It's actually said more often that God led them. God knew where they were going. They were being led in a certain place, in a certain way. And so God was doing this with not only the children of Israel, but with the patriarchs as well. And when we look back at the patriarchs, we find that they were desert people too. We often don't think about that, but Abraham and Sarah were desert people. Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel, they all lived in the desert just south of the promised land in the Negev. And they, brethren, were like us, and we are like them. In at least this sense, we all look for this city, the promised kingdom of God that will come, a city whose maker and builder is God. You see, they waited for the promised coming of Christ. But I want you to notice something very interesting in Genesis chapter 21. Something that Abraham did in particular that I think is fascinating. Genesis chapter 21 and verse 33, it says, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, And there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. It's just one quick verse, and sometimes we just read over it and we don't think anything about it. But Abraham planted a tamarisk tree. Now, this was done right after Abraham made a covenant with Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And in this particular region at Beersheba, it would come to mark the southern boundary of the nation of Israel. Now, today we know that Israel is all the way down to Eilat, down by the Red Sea. But at that time, it wasn't that far down. It was down about to where, he planted this tree. At this particular place, there isn't much more than rocks and sand, yet Abraham plants a tamarisk tree out here in the desert. And it's the only mention of Abraham ever planting anything, anywhere. Now, this tamarisk tree, I should have printed out a picture to show you. You can look it up later. But this particular tree is an interesting tree. It typically doesn't grow on its own. Now, I've seen pictures of it growing by the Jordan River on its own, but usually it's because it's surrounded and protected by other plants so it can be able to rise up. A lot of times trees that are out there by themselves, the goats will eat, the wild animals will eat of it, so it never has a chance to grow. But if you're going to see one in the wilderness, a tamarisk tree, it's probably because it was tended for, it was cared for, it had at least initially there was some cultivation that was needed. People lived around the tree, in other words. It required some protection. Otherwise, like I say, it just would get eaten up. You don't tend to see these trees grow in rugged conditions like other trees in the desert. The tamarisk tree has small scale-like leaves and small branches which give the tree a pine-like appearance. And during the heat of the day, salt comes out of the tree. And then during the nighttime, the salt absorbs the water, the moisture from the air. And so by the time the next day comes about, then it evaporates. And it kind of creates sort of an air condition-like condition under this tree. It's really a fascinating thing, this natural air conditioning. This cooling effect is another reason why people like to plant this tree for its shade in the desert, which if you need anything in the desert, you're going to need water, you're going to need shade. This tree is considered a slow-growing tree. Now, some have said that it takes about 400 years for this tree to reach its full height, which means that you don't plant one of these trees for you. You don't even plant it for your children. Probably your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren will enjoy this tree that you've planted. So why did Abraham plant a tamarisk tree? Well, maybe as a monument to the treaty between Abimelech and Abraham, or possibly as a memorial to the God who blessed him with a child. But I think there's more to it than that. In the book of Genesis, in chapters 12 and 15, just as reference, you don't need to turn there, God had promised Abraham the land of Canaan. You remember that promise that he gave to him. Right now, Abraham doesn't even own a square inch of this land. Nothing. He doesn't even have a place to bury his wife. He had to buy land to be able to do that. He had to, buy that field of Machpelah from the Hittite. But God says to him, I'm going to give you this land. And in chapter 21 of Genesis, Abraham went to Beersheba at the edge of the Negev desert, and he planted a tamarisk tree. Now I want you to think about the act, or the meaning of that act. He didn't own the land, and he knew that the shade of that tree would never shade him, and possibly never shade Isaac either. But he had the faith that someday that land would belong to his family, and he acted by planting a tamarisk tree as if to say, God, I believe you. I believe what you're telling me, that it's going to come to pass, and someday this tree is going to bless my great-grandchildren and my great-great-grandchildren, my descendants. Brethren, how long was the sojourn? About 400 years, right, when they would come back into the land. How long did it take for this tree to grow to full height? About 400 years. I love the imagery here because if you understand the tamarisk tree, you understand the principle that I think it teaches us. How much of your life is about you? Most of you sit here today having been baptized. The Spirit dwells in you. We heard a sermonette the other day. Actually, we heard this last week. There was a repeat that Mr. Thomas Robinson gave, but it was played in Kansas City about the security of your salvation. And as long as you follow on that path, your salvation is secure. What do you have now that you're putting forth to help others in their salvation? Doing what will bring me comfort or enjoyment today, or will gain something for me? Or are we doing something that will help bless other generations to come beyond us? Proverbs chapter 13:22 states this: a good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, for their grandchildren. It's a long-term thinking. It's long-term planning. What am I doing today that will benefit others tomorrow, next year, the next decade, the next 100 years? You know, there was a patient I remember years ago who was battling cancer for several years, and when he died, his wife found out that he had made plans for their financial future so that when he was gone, she was well cared for. He was very forward-thinking. Maybe we could ask the question this way: brethren, did you plant a tamarisk tree today? Or will you plant a tamarisk tree today? Will you do anything today that will outlive you and bless others years or decades or centuries down the road? Now, this doesn't have to apply physically, but spiritually. What impact has your example, your speech, your conduct, your teaching, your discussions had on others as we all search for this city built without hands? See, Abraham didn't just wait for someone else to come along and plant the tamarisk tree. He didn't just hunker down in a cave and say, I'm just going to wait here until the end comes. I mean, he was, in that sense, he was secure in his salvation, right? But he didn't just sit there and wait. He didn't just suffer through it. He was actually doing something. And so while we're waiting for the return of Christ, the question is, what are we doing to benefit others to that end as well? Starting first at our own families, and then extending out to the household of faith, and finally to those who we come in contact with on a daily basis in the world. I'd like you to turn to Matthew chapter 24. In Matthew chapter 24, Christ has some interesting words immediately after telling his disciples the signs of the end of the time, and telling them to stay awake because the Son of Man is coming in an hour that you do not expect. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 45, he says this: who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give him their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Brethren, are you so doing? Are you planting that tamarisk tree? Abraham went to Beersheba when there was no reason to plant a tamarisk tree for him. He did it for his ancestors. For his descendants. And he planted a tamarisk tree. What's your name? Did you plant a tamarisk tree today in Fulton? And will you plant a tamarisk tree tomorrow wherever you find yourself?